What if the Japan the world admires is not the Japan that truly exists? What if beneath the beauty of cherry blossoms, the silence of its temples, and the discipline of its people lies a history built on secrets the world was never meant to see? Because Japan was not just shaped by emperors, it was forged in war, controlled by shadows, and ruled by a code so absolute that even death was considered an honor. And yet, some of the darkest chapters were never fully told. Not in schools, not in books, not even in Japan itself. So the question is, what is the real story of Japan? And why does it still echo in everything the nation is today? This is the truth they never told you. Japan, a land of breathtaking beauty, where cherry blossoms fall like snow and silence feels almost sacred. A place where every movement is precise, every tradition deeply rooted, and every moment carries a sense of discipline the world admires. But beneath this calm and ordered surface lies something far more complex. A story shaped not only by peace, but by centuries of conflict, power, and transformation. Because Japan did not become what it is today by chance. It was built through isolation, forged by warriors, and guided by forces that operated beyond what most could see. From divine origins to brutal battles, from silence to sudden transformation, Japan's past is a journey unlike any other. And to understand the nation it has become, we must go back to a time before the modern world, before the empire, before the silence, to the very beginning. Before there were emperors, before there were samurai, before there was even a nation called Japan, there was only darkness and the silent vastness of the sky and sea. A world not yet formed, not yet named, waiting for something to begin. In ancient belief, Japan was not discovered, it was created. Born not from human hands, but from the will of gods. According to the oldest legends, two divine beings stood at the edge of existence, gazing down upon a chaotic, shapeless ocean. Their names were Izanagi and Izanami. With a jeweled spear, they stirred the waters below, and as droplets fell from its tip, the first island was formed. This was the beginning of Japan, not as a country, but as a sacred land shaped by divine power. From this first creation, more islands followed, rising one by one from the sea, each carrying the presence of the gods themselves. The land was not just earth and stone. It was alive, spiritual, and deeply connected to forces beyond human understanding. Mountains, rivers, forests, and winds were believed to hold spirits, watching, guiding, and sometimes judging those who lived among them. This belief would become the foundation of Shinto, the ancient spiritual heart of Japan, where nature itself was sacred, and every element of the world carried meaning. But creation was not without sacrifice. As the gods continued to shape the world, tragedy struck. Izanami, the mother of the land, was lost during the birth of fire, descending into the realm of darkness. Izanagi, consumed by grief, attempted to bring her back, but what he found in that shadowed world would change everything. When he returned, he carried with him not just sorrow, but purification. And from this act, something extraordinary happened. From his cleansing came new gods powerful, radiant, and destined to shape the future of Japan. Among them was Amaterasu, the sun goddess, whose light would rise above all others. She was not just a deity of the heavens, she became the symbol of life, order, and divine authority. It was believed that from her lineage came the emperors of Japan, rulers not just of land, but of sacred blood. This idea would echo through centuries, shaping how power was seen, protected, and never questioned. Because in Japan, the line between myth and reality was never truly separate. The gods were not distant stories. They were part of identity, part of rule, part of existence itself. And as the land continued to grow, so did the belief that Japan was not just another place in the world. It was chosen. A land guided by unseen forces, protected by divine will, and destined for something far greater than anyone could yet understand. But even in a land created by gods, the seeds of conflict were already beginning to take root. And what came next would transform this sacred world into something far more human. As the age of gods slowly faded into memory, something new began to rise across the sacred land of Japan. The mountains still stood tall, the rivers still flowed with quiet power, and the spirits of nature were still believed to watch over the world. But now, another force was emerging. A force not born from the heavens, but from the hands of men. The world was changing, and with that change came the beginning of rule. From the lineage of the sun goddess Amaterasu, it was believed that a sacred bloodline had descended upon the earth. This bloodline would become the foundation of Japan's imperial family. The first emperors were not seen as ordinary rulers. They were believed to be divine, living extensions of the gods themselves. Their authority was not earned through conquest, nor given by the people. It was absolute, unquestionable, and sacred. To obey the emperor was to obey the will of the heavens. And so, a system unlike any other began to take shape. The emperor stood at the center of it all, not just as a political leader, but as a symbol of unity, order, and divine balance. Rituals were performed in his name. Decisions were made under his authority. And across the land, people believed that their world remained in harmony because of his presence. But while the emperor held divine status, the reality beneath the surface was far more complex, because power does not remain still. As generations passed, the population of Japan grew. Villages expanded into communities. Communities formed into powerful clans. And with growth came competition. Land became more valuable. Resources became more limited. And slowly, tensions began to rise. Families sought influence. Clans sought control. And peace began to fracture. At first, these conflicts were small. Disputes over land, over honor, over survival. But as time moved forward, these small conflicts began to evolve into something far more dangerous. Because in a world where divine rule existed above, human ambition was growing below. And ambition always seeks power. To maintain order, to protect their lands, and to defend their influence, powerful families began to rely on something new. Warriors. Not just ordinary fighters, but trained, disciplined individuals who lived by strength, loyalty, and skill. These warriors would eventually become known as samurai. But in the beginning, they were something simpler. They were protectors, enforcers, survivors in a land that was no longer at peace. They trained relentlessly, their lives shaped by discipline, their purpose defined by loyalty to the clans they served. And as conflicts grew more intense, these warriors became more than just defenders. They became the true force behind power. Because while the emperor ruled in name, it was the warriors who began to control reality. And as the influence of these warriors expanded, so did their importance. Clans with stronger warriors gained more land. More land meant more power. And more power meant greater control over the future of Japan. A new hierarchy was forming, one not based purely on divine blood, but on strength. And in this growing shift, something significant began to happen. The balance between emperor and warrior began to change. The emperor remained sacred, untouchable, revered, but increasingly distant from the realities of conflict. While he symbolized unity, it was the warriors who faced the chaos of the world. And in that chaos, they began to rise. Among these warriors, leaders emerged, men of strategy, of strength, of vision. They commanded not just fighters, but entire armies. They made decisions that shaped the fate of regions, of clans, and eventually of the entire nation. These leaders did not need to be divine. They needed to be powerful. And so, the concept of leadership itself began to evolve. No longer was authority defined only by birth. It was reinforced by force. And with that shift, the foundation of Japan's future was quietly being rewritten. Because when power begins to move away from the throne, It does not disappear. It relocates. It hides. It transforms. Behind the image of divine rule, a new system was taking shape. One where the true control of the land did not always belong to the one who wore the crown, but to those who commanded the sword. And as this hidden structure grew stronger, it gave rise to something that would define Japan for centuries. A code, not written in law, but carved into the lives of those who lived by the blade. A code that demanded absolute loyalty. A code that valued honor above life itself. A code that left no room for weakness, no space for doubt. This was the beginning of Bushido, the way of the warrior. Under this code, a samurai's life was not his own. It belonged to his lord. To fail was to lose everything. To dishonor oneself was worse than death. And so, discipline became absolute. Emotion became controlled. Fear became irrelevant. Because in this world, even death could be embraced. And as powerful as this code was, it came with a cost. Because when loyalty becomes absolute, freedom begins to disappear. Choices become limited. Lives become controlled. And humanity slowly fades beneath duty. The samurai became symbols of strength, of honor, of discipline. But beneath that image, they were also bound. Controlled by a system that demanded everything and gave nothing in return but purpose. And still, the emperor remained. A symbol above all, untouched, unquestioned, but no longer alone in power. Because now, there were others. Others who shaped the land not through divine right, but through action, through force, through control. And as Japan continued to evolve, this quiet shift would grow louder. The tension between symbol and reality, between throne and sword, would continue to expand, until one day it would no longer remain hidden. Because the next phase of Japan's story would not be about quiet transformation. It would be about dominance, control, and the rise of a power that would stand not beside the emperor, but above him. And when that moment came, Japan would never be the same again. As the balance of power in Japan continued to shift, the role of the warrior was no longer just necessary. It became essential. The land was no longer at peace. Clans grew stronger, rivalries deepened, and conflict became a constant presence across the nation. In this new world, survival was no longer guaranteed by birth or belief. It had to be earned. And those who could fight began to shape the future. These warriors, once simple protectors of land and family, were evolving into something far more disciplined, far more controlled, and far more feared. They would come to be known as samurai. But the samurai were not just fighters. They were a way of life. From a young age, they were trained not only in combat, but in mindset. Their bodies were sharpened through endless practice. Their minds were hardened through discipline, and their hearts were conditioned to accept a reality most could never understand. Because to be a samurai was to live with the constant presence of death. They learned to fight with precision, every movement controlled, every strike intentional. The sword was not just a weapon. It was an extension of their being, a reflection of their soul. To master the sword was to master oneself. But skill alone was not enough, because in a world filled with conflict, strength without control becomes chaos. And so, a code began to take form, not written in books, but passed through generations. A code that would define the samurai more than any battle ever could. This was Bushido, the way of the warrior. It demanded loyalty beyond question. A samurai's life belonged to his lord. His purpose was not his own. It required honor beyond fear. To act with integrity, even in the face of death. To stand firm when others would fall. To remain calm when the world around him collapsed. And above all, it demanded acceptance of death. Because a samurai who feared death could never truly be free. This belief shaped everything. It shaped how they fought, how they lived, how they made decisions, even how they died. In moments of failure, dishonor was not tolerated. There was only one path left: seppuku, a ritual of self-sacrifice. Not seen as an act of defeat, but as a final act of control, a way to restore honor even in death. To the outside world, this may seem extreme, even unthinkable. But within the world of the samurai, it was the ultimate expression of loyalty and discipline. And as this code spread, so did the influence of the samurai. They became more than warriors. They became symbols. Symbols of strength, of order, of unwavering loyalty. Clans depended on them. Leaders trusted them. And gradually, the entire structure of society began to revolve around them. Because while the emperor remained a sacred figure, it was the samurai who enforced order on the ground. They protected lands, collected taxes, maintained control, and when necessary, they fought without hesitation. Their presence was respected, their authority rarely questioned, and their loyalty was absolute. But beneath this image of honor and discipline, there was another truth. Because when a person gives up their freedom completely, they also give up a part of themselves. The samurai were bound to their lords, bound to their code, bound to a system that demanded perfection, but allowed no weakness. They could not choose their path. They could not question their role. They could not escape the life they were born into. And over time, this created something dangerous. A society built on control. A system where order was maintained not just by belief, but by fear. Because while the samurai protected the land, they also enforced power. And power, when left unchecked, always grows. As the influence of the samurai expanded, so did the ambitions of those who commanded them. Leaders began to realize that control of warriors meant control of the land itself. And with that realization, the next transformation of Japan began to take shape. A transformation that would shift power even further away from the emperor and place it into the hands of those who ruled. Not by divine right, but by strength, strategy, and force. The age of the samurai had begun, but what followed would be far more than just the rise of warriors. It would be the rise of a new kind of ruler. One who did not sit on the throne, but controlled everything behind it. And as this new power emerged, Japan would enter one of the most defining periods in its history. A time of control, a time of order, and a time where the true rulers of the nation would no longer be the ones seen, but the ones hidden in the shadows. As the influence of the samurai continued to rise, the structure of power in Japan began to change in ways few could fully see. The emperor remained at the center of the nation, a symbol of divine authority, respected and revered by all. His presence represented unity, tradition, and the sacred connection between heaven and earth. But beneath this stability, something more complex was unfolding. Because while the emperor held the highest title, he no longer held the strongest power. Across the land, powerful military leaders had begun to emerge, men who commanded armies and controlled territories. These leaders were not bound by divine lineage. They rose through strength, through strategy, and through the loyalty of the warriors who followed them. And among these leaders, one title began to rise above all others: Shogun. The word itself carried weight. It meant general. The shogun was not just a military commander. He was the one who controlled the samurai. And that meant controlling Japan itself. The emperor still held his throne, but his role had begun to shift. He became distant from the realities of war and the decisions of the land. The emperor remained the face of the nation, but the shogun became its hands. This was the beginning of a new system. One where power was divided, but not equally. One where authority was visible, but control was hidden. The traditions remained intact, but behind the scenes, the true decisions were no longer made in the imperial court. They were made in war rooms. This system was the shogunate, A government led not by the emperor, but by the shogun. Built on discipline and absolute control, the samurai became the backbone of this system. They enforced laws and ensured that the will of the shogun was carried out. Order was maintained. Peace was enforced. But it was a silence created by control. Rebellion was not just discouraged. It was crushed. Yet despite this shift, the emperor was never removed. He remained untouchable, a symbol that could not be erased. The emperor provided legitimacy. The shogun provided power. Together, they formed a system that would last for centuries. Farmers farmed, artisans created, merchants traded, samurai ruled, and above them all stood the unseen hand of the shogun. But beneath that control, pressure was building. When power is concentrated in the hands of a few, it creates stability, but also tension. As the years passed, different shogunates rose and fell, each one refining the system, strengthening the order. But no power lasts forever. While the shogun ruled from the shadows, forces beyond Japan were beginning to move. Forces that would challenge everything. The carefully constructed balance between symbol and power would begin to collapse. The world outside was about to knock on Japan's door. As the shogunate tightened its control over Japan, the nation entered a period of order unlike anything it had experienced before. Society was structured. Power was centralized. And for a time, it seemed as though stability had finally been achieved. But beyond the shores of Japan, the world was changing. New empires were rising. Trade routes were expanding. Foreign ships began to travel across distant oceans, reaching lands that had once remained untouched. And slowly, they began to approach Japan. At first, these encounters were rare. Foreign traders arrived with goods, with new ideas, and with knowledge of a world far larger than Japan. Alongside them came missionaries, bringing unfamiliar beliefs, speaking of different gods, different ways of life. To some, this was an opportunity, a chance to learn, to grow, to connect with the outside world. But to the leaders of Japan, it was something else entirely. It was a threat, because with every foreign influence came the possibility of change. And change meant loss of control. The shogunate had built a system of order, of hierarchy, of discipline. A world where every person knew their place, where loyalty was absolute, and where power flows in a carefully controlled structure. Foreign ideas had the power to disrupt that structure, to challenge authority, to question tradition. And so, a decision was made. A decision that would define Japan for over 2 centuries. Japan would close itself off from the world. Borders were sealed. Foreign ships were turned away. Trade was heavily restricted, and contact with the outside world was reduced to almost nothing. This policy would come to be known as Sakoku, the closed country. It was not simply a political decision. It was a complete transformation of how Japan would exist. No longer would it look outward. No longer would it allow foreign influence to shape its future. Instead, Japan turned inward. The people were forbidden from leaving. Those who attempted to return from abroad were often not allowed back. Foreign religions were banned. Western ideas were suppressed. And the presence of outsiders became rare, controlled, and heavily monitored. The world moved forward, but Japan chose to stand still. And for a time, it worked. Peace was maintained. The samurai upheld order. Society functioned within the boundaries set by the shogunate. Cities grew. Culture flourished. Art, poetry, and tradition deepened, untouched by external influence. Japan became a world of its own, isolated but stable, quiet but controlled. But isolation comes with a cost, because while Japan remained closed, the world beyond its borders continued to evolve. Technology advanced. Weapons became more powerful. Nations grew stronger. And knowledge expanded in ways Japan could not see. The gap between Japan and the outside world began to widen, slowly at first, but steadily. And within Japan, something else began to happen. Generations grew up knowing only this closed world. A world where outside influence was not just distant, it was unknown. Curiosity faded, questions disappeared, and over time, isolation became normal. But beneath this calm surface, tension still existed, because no system can remain completely closed forever, and no nation can ignore the rest of the world indefinitely. The walls that had been built to protect Japan would one day be tested, and when that moment came, it would not be gradual, it would not be gentle, it would arrive suddenly, with force, with power, and with a presence Japan could no longer ignore, because beyond the horizon, something was coming. Something that would challenge everything the shogunate had built. Something that would force Japan to make a choice. Remain closed and risk destruction, or open its doors and face a future it could not control. And when that moment arrived, the silence of isolation would be shattered forever. As Japan sealed itself away from the outside world, a new kind of life began to take shape within its borders. The chaos of foreign influence had been removed. The pressure of outside forces had disappeared, and in its place, a quiet, controlled world emerged. For the people of Japan, this isolation was not a sudden change. It became a way of life. Generations were born into it, raised within it, and over time, it became all they knew. The outside world faded into myth, into distant stories few could truly imagine. Life within Japan settled into a rhythm, a structure defined by order, discipline, and tradition. Society was divided into clear classes. Samurai stood at the top, enforcing the will of the shogunate. Farmers worked the land, providing the foundation of survival. Artisans crafted goods with skill and precision. Merchants traded within strict limits, moving goods across towns and cities. Each role had its place. Each person had their duty, and stepping outside that role was not easily allowed. In the cities, life flourished in its own unique way. Edo grew into one of the largest urban centers in the world. Streets filled with movement. Markets buzzed with quiet energy. Lanterns lit the night with a soft, controlled glow. Yet even in this activity, there was order. Laws governed behavior. Movement was regulated, and the presence of authority was always felt, even when unseen. But within this controlled environment, something remarkable began to develop: culture. Without the influence of the outside world, Japan began to turn inward, not just politically, but creatively. Art forms evolved with incredible depth. Kabuki theater brought dramatic stories to life. Woodblock prints captured moments of beauty, of nature, of everyday existence. Poetry reflected the passing of seasons, the quiet emotions of life, the beauty found in simplicity. Even in isolation, creativity thrived, and perhaps because of isolation, it became more refined. Nature itself remained at the center of life. The changing seasons were not just observed, they were celebrated. Cherry blossoms in spring, warm rains in summer, the deep colors of autumn, the silence of winter. Each moment carried meaning. Each change reminded people of something deeper, something beyond the physical world. And through all of this, the belief in unseen spirits remained strong. The forests were alive. The rivers carried presence. The wind whispered through the land. The spiritual connection between people and nature did not fade. It deepened. But even within this beauty, this culture, this sense of harmony, there was something else, something less visible: control. Because while life appeared peaceful, it was carefully managed. The shogunate maintained strict authority over the population. Travel was restricted. Movement between regions required permission. Information was controlled, and any sign of rebellion was dealt with quickly. The system worked because it allowed little room for resistance, and over time, people adapted. They followed the rules. They accepted their roles. They lived within the boundaries set before them. But adaptation does not mean absence of desire. Because even in a controlled world, curiosity still exists. Questions still arise. And somewhere, in quiet conversations, in hidden thoughts, in moments of reflection, people wondered, what lies beyond our shores? What exists outside this world we know? But those questions rarely found answers, because the world beyond Japan remained distant, invisible, unknown. And so life continued. Days turned into years. Years turned into generations. And Japan remained, unchanged on the surface, stable, controlled, at peace. But beneath that peace, time was moving, and beyond the borders, the world was changing faster than ever before. Technology was advancing, nations were expanding, power was shifting on a global scale, and while Japan remained still, the world did not. The gap between isolation and reality continued to grow, quietly, slowly, but inevitably, until the moment came when that gap could no longer be ignored. Because isolation can protect a nation, but it can also leave it unprepared. And when the outside world finally returned, it would not come as a visitor, it would come as a force that would shake Japan to its core. And in that moment, everything that had been preserved for centuries would face a future could not avoid. For over 2 centuries, Japan had remained closed to the world, its borders sealed, its people isolated, its system preserved in a delicate balance of control and tradition. The outside world had become distant, almost unreal. But beyond the horizon, change had been building. And one day, that change arrived. It began not with words, but with a sight. Dark shapes appearing on the distant waters. Unfamiliar, massive, unlike anything the people of Japan had ever seen before. At first, they seemed like shadows, slowly rising from the mist. But as they drew closer, their true form became clear. Ships, enormous, towering vessels of iron and wood, moving with unnatural force. Smoke poured from their engines, rising into the sky like dark clouds. The sea trembled beneath them. These were not ordinary ships. They were something entirely new, powerful, industrial, foreign. They would come to be known as the Black Ships, and their arrival would change Japan forever. Fear spread quickly along the coast. Villagers watched from a distance, unsure of what they were witnessing. Samurai were called to prepare. Officials scrambled to respond, but no one truly understood what they were facing. Because these ships did not belong to the world Japan knew. They came from a world that had advanced while Japan had remained still. A world of steam power, of industrial strength, of weapons far beyond anything Japan possessed. And at the center of this arrival was a man, Commodore Matthew Perry, a representative of the United States Navy, but more than that, a symbol of the outside world's growing power. He did not come quietly. He did not come to ask. He came with purpose, with authority, and with a message that could not be ignored. Japan must open its doors. For the shogunate, this was a moment of crisis. Everything they had built, everything they had protected, was now being challenged. The policy of isolation, Sakoku, had kept Japan stable for generations. But now, it stood face to face with a force that could not simply be turned away, because these ships did not just represent trade. They represented pressure, power, and the threat of what would happen if Japan refused. The technology alone was overwhelming. Cannons capable of destruction beyond anything Japan had seen. Ships that moved without wing. Weapons that symbolized a new era of warfare. Resistance suddenly seemed uncertain. And so, a question emerged. One that would define the future of Japan. Should they resist and risk destruction? Or should they open their doors and face a world they did not understand? The shogunate hesitated. Negotiations began. Time was bought. But the pressure did not disappear, because Perry would return. And when he did, the message would be even clearer. Japan could no longer remain hidden. The world had found it, and it was not leaving. Eventually, a decision was made, not out of desire, but out of necessity. Japan would open its ports, treaties were signed, trade began. And with that single decision, over 200 years of isolation came to an end. But opening the doors was not a simple act. It was a transformation, because along with trade came influence, ideas, technology, culture. The world began to enter Japan at a pace it had never experienced before, and with it came change, rapid, unstoppable, and for many, overwhelming. The old system began to shake. The authority of the shogunate was questioned. The role of the samurai began to shift, and the balance that had once defined Japan started to break apart. What had once been stable was now uncertain. What had once been controlled was now unpredictable. And the people of Japan found themselves standing at the edge of something new, a future they had not chosen, but could no longer avoid. Because the arrival of the black ships was not just an event, it was a signal that the world had changed, and Japan would have to change with it. And as the nation began to move forward, the question was no longer whether change would happen, but how far it would go. Because the next chapter of Japan's story would not be about isolation, it would be about transformation. A transformation so rapid, so powerful, that it would reshape the nation in ways no one could have imagined. And once it began, there would be no turning back. The moment Japan opened its doors to the world, everything began to change. Not slowly, not gradually, but with a speed and intensity that few could have imagined. For over 200 years, Japan had remained isolated, protected within its own system of order and tradition. But now, that system was being reshaped by forces from beyond its shores. The world had arrived, and it brought with it a new reality. Foreign ships filled the ports. Western technology began to spread. New ideas, new systems, new ways of thinking entered Japan all at once. And for the first time, the nation was forced to confront a truth it could no longer ignore. It had fallen behind. While Japan had preserved its traditions, the outside world had advanced. Industrial power, modern weapons, new forms of government, all stood in stark contrast. And in that realization, a decision was made. Japan would not resist change. It would embrace it. What followed was one of the most rapid transformations in human history. The old order began to collapse. The authority of the shogunate, which had controlled Japan for centuries, weakened under the pressure of internal conflict and external influence, and soon it would fall. In its place, power returned to the emperor. But this was not a return to the past. It was the beginning of something entirely new. This moment would become known as the Meiji Restoration, a turning point where Japan chose to rebuild itself as something stronger, something modern. The government began to restructure. Feudal systems were dismantled. The class hierarchy that had defined society for generations was broken apart. Samurai, once the backbone of power, found their role fading. Their swords, once symbols of authority, were no longer the center of the nation's strength. For many, this change was painful. The identity they had lived by was disappearing. The code they had followed was no longer enough. But the transformation did not stop. It accelerated. Railways were built, connecting distant regions. Factories rose, introducing industrial production. Modern education systems were established, teaching science, mathematics, and global knowledge. The military was restructured, adopting Western strategies and technology. Japan was no longer looking inward. It was racing forward. Cities expanded, technology advanced, communication improved. And within a single generation, the nation began to resemble something entirely different. But transformation comes with sacrifice. Tradition was challenged, old ways were abandoned, and the balance between past and future became difficult to maintain. Some embraced the change. They saw opportunity, growth, strength. Others resisted. They feared the loss of identity, the erosion of culture. And in that tension, conflict emerged, not just on the battlefield, but within society itself. Because change at this scale is never simple. It is disruptive. It is uncomfortable. And it forces people to question everything they once believed. Yet despite the struggle, the transformation continued, relentless, focused, driven by a single goal, to become strong enough to stand among powerful nations. And step by step, Japan achieved it, from isolation to industrial power, from feudal system to modern state, from a nation closed to the world, to one that now stood ready to face it. But with strength comes ambition. And as Japan grew more powerful, it began to look beyond its own borders once again, not as a closed nation, but as a rising force. Because transformation was only the beginning. What came next would be expansion, and with expansion came consequences. Because the story of Japan was no longer just about survival. It was about power, and power always changes everything. As Japan completed its rapid transformation into a modern nation, it did not stop its survival. It did not stop its stability. It looked outward and saw opportunity. The world was no longer a distant unknown. It had become a stage where powerful nations expanded their influence, claimed territories, and shaped the future through strength. And Japan was ready to take its place among them. The lessons of isolation had been learned. The urgency of modernization had been fulfilled. Now, the focus shifted to something new: expansion. Japan's leaders believed that to remain strong, the nation could not simply defend itself. It had to grow. It had to secure resources, protect its interests, and establish its presence beyond its own islands. And so, the rise of empire began. The first signs appeared in nearby lands. Korea, a neighboring nation with deep historical ties to Japan, became the center of attention. Influence turned into pressure. Pressure turned into control. And eventually, control became occupation. Japan moved swiftly, applying both diplomacy and force, ensuring that its position in Korea was secured. But Korea was only the beginning. Across the sea, a much larger power stood: China, a nation with a long and powerful history, but one that had begun to weaken under internal struggles and external pressures. Japan saw an opportunity, a chance to prove its strength, a chance to demonstrate that it was no longer a nation to be underestimated. The First Sino-Japanese War erupted, and the outcome shocked the world. Japan, once isolated and unknown, defeated a major regional power. The victory was decisive. It sent a message that echoed across nations. Japan had arrived. It was no longer catching up. It was competing and winning. But with victory came confidence, and with confidence came ambition. Japan continued to expand its influence, strengthening its military, building its navy, and preparing for a future where power would define its place. Then came another test, one that would elevate Japan even further: the Russo-Japanese War, a conflict between Japan and one of the largest empires on Earth, Russia. At the time, few believed Japan could win. Russia was vast, powerful, established. Japan was still seen as a rising nation, new to the global stage. But the outcome defied expectations. Through strategy, discipline, and relentless execution, Japan achieved victory once again. It became the first Asian nation in modern history to defeat a major European power in war. The world watched and took notice. Japan was no longer just a participant in global affairs. It had become a dominant force, a nation capable of shaping events far beyond its borders. With each victory, the empire grew stronger. Territories expanded, influence spread, and the belief that Japan was destined for greatness became stronger than ever. But expansion comes at a cost, because every gain of power creates new tensions, new conflicts, new resistance. And as Japan's presence expanded across Asia, so did the impact of its actions. For some, Japan was seen as a rising power, a symbol of strength and progress. But for others, it became something else, a force of control, a presence that brought not just order, but dominance. The line between strength and aggression began to blur, and as that line faded, the path forward became more dangerous. Because when a nation rises quickly, it must decide how it will use its power, and power, when driven by ambition, can lead to consequences far greater than anyone expects. As Japan moved into the 20th century, its position in the world was undeniable. It had transformed, it had expanded. But the story was far from over, because the next phase would not be about proving strength, it would be pushing it further. And in that pursuit, Japan would step into one of the most intense and destructive periods in human history. A time where power, ambition, and conflict would collide on a global scale, because the rise of empire is only the beginning. What comes next is what defines its legacy. As Japan's empire continued to expand, the line between strength and control began to blur. What had once been seen as a rise driven by survival and ambition was now evolving into something far more complex. Power had been achieved. Influence had spread. But with that power came a new question. How far was Japan willing to go to maintain it? Across Asia, the presence of the Japanese Empire grew stronger. Territories once independent now found themselves under foreign authority. Control was established not only through governance, but through military force. And while expansion brought resources and strategic advantage, it also brought tension. Resistance began to rise. Voices that once remained silent began to speak. And in response, control tightened. The relationship between empire and those it governed became strained. Because when power is extended beyond its borders, it does not always bring unity. It often brings conflict. In regions like Korea and parts of China, the impact of Japanese expansion was deeply felt. Authority was enforced, systems were imposed, and for many, daily life changed in ways that were not chosen, but required. The reality of empire was no longer just about growth. It was about control, and control requires force. As the military grew stronger, its influence within Japan also expanded. Decisions were no longer driven only by political leadership, but increasingly by military strategy. The voice of the soldier became louder. The direction of the nation became more aggressive. And slowly, the balance between governance and military power began to shift. The empire was no longer just defending its position. It was pushing forward, determined to secure its place as a dominant force in the region. But expansion is never without consequence. Each move created new tensions. Each decision affected more lives. And each step forward brought the empire closer to a larger conflict. Because beyond Asia, the world was watching. Nations observed Japan's actions with growing concern. Alliances were forming. Strategies were being prepared. And the global stage was becoming increasingly unstable. Yet within Japan, the belief in strength, in unity, in destiny remained strong. The idea that the nation was meant to rise, meant to lead, meant to secure its future at any cost. And so, the path forward continued. Not slowly, not cautiously, but with determination. Because in moments like this, nations often believe they are shaping history. But in reality, they are stepping into it. And history does not always unfold as expected. As the 1930s approached, the tension that had been building began to reach a breaking point. Conflict expanded. Military operations intensified. and the scale of involvement grew larger than ever before. What had once been regional was becoming international, and with that shift, the stakes became higher, because this was no longer just about territory. It was about power on a global scale. And as Japan moved forward, driven by ambition and guided by its own strength, it found itself on a path that would lead to a defining moment. Because the next chapter would not be about growth or control or influence. It would be about war. A war that would change everything. A war that would test the limits of power, of resilience, and of humanity itself. And when that war began, the world would never be the same again. As tensions across the world reached their breaking point, the conflict that had been building for years finally erupted into a war unlike anything humanity's seen. Nations were drawn into it one by one, alliances forming, strategies unfolding, and battles spreading across continents and oceans. This was not a regional conflict. This was a global war, and Japan was at its center. Driven by its rapid rise, its expanding empire, and its determination to secure its place in the world, Japan became deeply involved in World War II. The scale was immense. The stakes were higher than ever before, and the path forward would lead to consequences beyond imagination. As the war intensified, Japan moved with speed and force. Military operations expanded across Asia and the Pacific. Territories were taken, strategic positions secured, and for a time, the momentum seemed unstoppable. But war is never one-sided. As Japan advanced, resistance grew stronger. Other nations responded with equal force. Battles became more intense, losses increased, and the cost of war began to rise, not just in resources, but in lives. The conflict stretched across land, across sea, and across the sky. Naval battles reshaped control of the oceans. Air power introduced a new dimension of warfare, bringing destruction from above. And as the war continued, the reality of its impact became unavoidable. Cities were affected, infrastructure weakened, and the strain on the nation began to show. Yet despite the growing challenges, the belief in resilience remained strong. The determination to continue, to endure, to fight, pushed Japan forward. But as time passed, the balance began to shift. The momentum that once favored expansion began to fade. Opposition grew stronger, resources became limited, and the pressures of a global conflict began to take their toll. The war was no longer a series of victories. It had become a struggle to maintain position, to hold ground, to survive. And then came the moment that would change everything. A moment that would define not only the outcome of the war, but history itself. In August of 1945, two events occurred that would leave a permanent mark on the world. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were struck by a devastating force. The impact was immediate, the destruction overwhelming. In a matter of moments, entire landscapes were transformed, and the reality of what had happened was felt not just in Japan, but across the entire world. It was a turning point, one that brought the war to an end. But it did not end quietly. It ended with a realization of human conflict's scale. For Japan, the consequences were profound. The war had come to an end. The empire that had expanded so rapidly now faced collapse. The nation stood at a crossroads, changed, shaken, and forced to confront a new reality. After the rise, expansion, and conflict, Japan now faced a question it had never faced before. What comes after defeat? The answer would not be immediate, but it would define the future of the nation in ways no one could yet fully understand. Because from this moment of destruction, something unexpected would begin to rise. Not power through expansion, not strength through conflict, but a different kind of transformation. One built not on war, but on rebuilding. And as the world slowly moved forward from the shadows of conflict, Japan would begin a journey unlike any other, A journey not of empire, but of rebirth. In the aftermath of war, Japan stood in silence. The once rising empire, now reduced to a nation facing the weight of its past. The cities bore the marks of destruction. The economy struggled to stand, and the people were left to rebuild their sense of identity. The war had ended, but its impact remained. And yet, within that silence, something began to take shape. Not power, but determination. A quiet, unwavering resolve to begin again. Because even in the face of devastation, the spirit of a nation does not disappear. It endures. Under a new reality, Japan began its transformation. The systems that once defined its structure were re-examined. The focus shifted away from military expansion, toward stability, toward growth, toward rebuilding a society that could stand strong without conflict. New policies were introduced, governance evolved, and the foundations of a different kind of nation began to form. One that looked not to the past, but to the future. Industry became the driving force of change. Factories were rebuilt, infrastructure was restored. Technology became a priority. But this was not just physical rebuilding. It was a transformation of mindset. Education expanded, knowledge spread, innovation was encouraged, and a new generation grew up with a different vision of what Japan could become. A nation not defined by war, but by progress. The process was not easy. It required effort, discipline, and sacrifice. But these were qualities Japan already possessed, and now they were redirected, focused not on conflict, but on creation, on development, on growth. And slowly, the results began to appear. Industries advanced. Japan began to establish itself once again, not as a military power, but as an economic force known for precision, quality, and innovation. The same discipline that once defined the samurai now defined the workforce. The same dedication that once fueled expansion now fueled progress. As years passed, Japan's transformation became undeniable. From the ashes of war, it had rebuilt itself into one of the most advanced nations. Technology, infrastructure, and culture evolved together, creating a society that balanced tradition and modernity in a way few others could. The world watched, and once again, Japan stood on the global stage, not as an empire, but as a symbol of resilience. Yet even in this new identity, the past was never completely forgotten. The lessons remained. The memories endured and shaped Japan's future. Because true strength is not just about power. It is about understanding, about growth, and about choosing a different path forward. Japan moved into a new era defined not by conquest, but by contribution. A nation that once closed itself off, now connected with the world. A nation that once faced destruction, now stood as one of the strongest examples of recovery in modern history. But even as Japan reached new heights, one truth remained. The past does not disappear. It echoes, it shapes, and it influences everything. To truly understand Japan, one must see not just its present, but the journey that brought it here. The story continues. As Japan stepped fully into the modern era, the transformation that had begun after the war continued to accelerate. What was once a nation rebuilding from destruction was now becoming one of the most advanced societies in the world. Cities rose higher, technology moved faster, and the influence of Japan began to extend far beyond its borders. The focus was no longer on expansion through force, but on growth through innovation. Industries evolved with precision. Manufacturing reached levels of quality that set global standards. Products designed in Japan began to appear across the world. From automobiles to electronics, from engineering to design, the nation became known for excellence. But this rise was not accidental. It was built on the same foundation that had shaped Japan for centuries. Discipline, attention to detail, dedication to continuous improvement. These values, once seen in the way of the samurai, now existed in factories, in offices, in everyday life. Work became more than a responsibility. It became a reflection of identity. And through that identity, Japan built its reputation. Technology became one of the defining forces of this new era. Innovations in electronics transformed communication. Advances in transportation connected cities with speed and efficiency. High-speed trains moved across the country with precision, symbolizing a nation that had mastered both time and motion. And in the world of robotics, Japan pushed boundaries even further, exploring what machines could achieve. Yet modern Japan was not defined by technology alone. Its culture continued to influence the world in powerful ways. Traditional art, architecture, and philosophy remained deeply respected. At the same time, new forms of culture emerged. Film, animation, fashion, and design began to reach audiences across continents. What was once a nation shaped by isolation had become a global cultural force. And within this balance between past and present, Japan created something unique. A society where ancient traditions and modern innovation existed side by side, where temples stood quietly beside towering skyscrapers, where centuries-old rituals continued as the future moved forward. This balance became one of Japan's greatest strengths because it allowed the nation to evolve without losing its identity, to grow without forgetting its roots. And as Japan's influence expanded globally, its role in the world became more defined. It was no longer just a nation recovering from its past. It had become a leader, an example of what transformation could achieve. A country that demonstrated how discipline, resilience, and vision could shape the future. But with global presence comes new challenges: economic pressures, technological competition, social change. The pace of modern life introduced complexities that required constant adaptation. And once again, Japan faced a familiar reality: the need to evolve, because the world never stands still. Yet despite these challenges, Japan continued to move forward, guided by innovation and the lessons of its past, because every stage of its journey, from myth to empire, from isolation to transformation, had shaped the nation. Japan was never defined by a single moment, not by its rise, not by its fall, but by its ability to adapt, to change, to endure, and to move forward, no matter what stood in its path. And as the modern world continues to evolve, Japan remains a part of that story. A nation shaped by history, but never limited by it. A nation that continues to look ahead, because the story of Japan is not just a story of the past. It is a story that is still being written. Every day, every moment, every step into the future. Behind the beauty of Japan's landscapes, beyond the precision of its cities, and beneath the harmony that the world so often sees, lies a history layered with complexity. A story not defined by a single narrative, but by many. Because Japan is not just a nation of temples and technology. It is a nation shaped by contrast, by moments of creation and destruction, of isolation and expansion, of tradition and transformation. And within that contrast, there are truths that are not always fully told. History, as it is often presented, can appear clean, organized, structured into clear beginnings and endings. But reality is rarely so simple. Beneath the surface, there are decisions, consequences, and perspectives that do not always fit into a single story. And Japan's journey is no exception. From its earliest myths of divine creation, the idea of identity has always been tied to something greater than the individual. A belief in order, in structure, in a connection between the seen and the unseen. This belief shaped how power was understood, how authority was accepted, and how society functioned. The emperor, once seen as divine, represented more than leadership. He symbolized continuity, stability, a link between past and present. But behind that symbol, power shifted. The rise of the samurai, the control of the shogunate, the decisions made in moments of pressure, all reveal a deeper truth. That authority is not always where it appears to be. That influence can exist in shadows, just as much as in light. And as Japan moved through its periods of isolation, expansion, and transformation, each stage left its mark. The decision to close the country protected it, but also separated it. The decision to open it brought growth, but also disruption. The rise of empire created strength, but also conflict. The fall that followed led to reflection, and ultimately to rebirth. These are not contradictions, they are layers. And it is within these layers that the true story exists. A story that cannot be reduced to simple definitions of right or wrong, of success or failure. Because history is not only about what happened, it is about how it is understood and how it continues to shape the present. Even today, echoes of the past remain. In the discipline seen in everyday life, in the respect for tradition, in the balance between innovation and heritage. These are not accidents. They are reflections of a journey. And yet, there are still questions. Questions about identity, about memory, about how a nation reconciles its past with its future. These questions do not always have clear answers, but they remain important because they remind us that history is not static. It is alive. It evolves. And it continues to influence the world in ways we may not always see. Japan's legacy is not defined by a single era. It is defined by its ability to adapt, to face challenges, to rebuild, and to move forward, even when the path is uncertain. And perhaps that is the deeper truth, that the strength of a nation is not found only in its moments of power, but in its ability to change, to learn, to grow. And as we look at Japan today, we see more than a country. We see a story of resilience, of transformation, a story that reminds us that behind every image, every perception, every understanding, there is always more beneath the surface. And that to truly understand any nation, we must be willing to look beyond what is seen and explore what is hidden. And so, the story of Japan continues. A nation born from myth, shaped by war, transformed by isolation, and reborn through resilience. From the silence of its temples to the energy of its cities, every moment carries the echoes of everything that came before. Because Japan is not just a place on the map, it is a journey through time. A story where gods and emperors, warriors and innovators, tradition and transformation all exist within a single path. And perhaps the greatest truth is this, that no nation is ever defined by only one chapter. It is defined by how it rises, how it falls, and how it chooses to move forward. This is KOO Legends, History Stories World, where myths breathe, history whispers, and stories ignite the imagination. If this journey opened your eyes, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the greatest stories are still waiting to be uncovered.